Hi, I'm Liz. I'm speaking on behalf of the Philosophical Research Society. If you don't know about us already, you can visit us at our website, prs.org, or if you're on the gram, you can follow us at philosophical_research_society and stay up to date with all the cool stuff that we're doing, including online talks like this. So real quick, again, if you don't know about us, we're a cultural institution. We have all sorts of events that span from the esoteric to the mystical to the philosophical to the cultural, as far as like we do film screenings, we do music events, lots of concerts, and we're just continuing to expand our events as well as our offerings. So we also do workshops and we have talks like this. We have quite the catalog of past recordings that includes lectures and workshops as well. Conversations. We also have a radio show that's local here in Los Angeles that is once a month. But yeah, we're pretty much in every corner of the internet, as one should be. And if you are local to Los Angeles, obviously, please check out our calendar, again, at prs.org/events. We also just launched a membership program that offers you discounts at our amazing bookstore and also member-only events, like going to our library on member-only days. And yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. Again, like our bookstore has all kinds of things from tarot cards to rare books to our own personal merch. And if you're not local to Los Angeles, we do things like this. We do online talks and we have a very active YouTube page as well. So that spans basically the 10 years of us recording various types of lectures around philosophy, religion, psychology, astrology, mysticism, you name it. So that's the Philosophical Research Society. And for today, just a little bit of housekeeping. Really, the main thing is we're going to be doing a Q&A after Mitch's discussion. So if you have any questions during or after, please make sure to write them into the comments section. If you want to include your name and where you're, asking a question from, that will be helpful for me too, so I can read those questions out for Mitch. He's going to talk for about an hour, and then our Q&A will be about 15 minutes. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful host and speaker. Mitch Horowitz is the host of Alien Encounters, Fact or Fiction on Discovery Max. He is a PEN award-winning historian, a former vice president at Penguin Random House, and one of today's most literate voices of occultism, mysticism, and the unexplained, with bylines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and appearances in Sundance premiering movies, popular TV docuseries, and award-winning documentaries, as well as on CBS Sunday Morning, Dateline NBC, and all things NPR's All Things Considered, as well as other major media. Mitch's books translated into 9 languages include Occult America, Happy Warriors, Uncertain Places, The Miracle Club, Daydream Believer, and Modern Occultism. His work is censored in China. He is hosting a forthcoming historical podcast from Spectre Vision, Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. So more info on that soon. All right, take it away, Mitch.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Liz, for your introduction. Liz wears many different hats, one of which is that of a great graphic artist. A lot of the really, truly beautiful graphics and designs that you see produced in connection with the PRS events are designed by Liz, and her work is just stunning. Also, a thanks to Sarah, who is working our AV tonight, and to Kelly Carmina, who does so much for PRS and keeps the programming so varied and really wonderful. Someone just said hello from Crotona Dome. I know where they're coming from. I have a small tradition that I do each time I speak digitally for PRS as opposed to being there live with you, and that is I like to have this little statue of Bastet with me. This echoes a tradition that Manly P. Hall practiced himself in Manly Hall's office. Sits to this day a beautiful, beautiful Tibetan Buddhist altar. And there used to be on this altar a wonderful little um, statuette of the Egyptian cat god Bastet. And I was told that Manly would say a prayer or a tribute to Bastet each Sunday morning before he entered the auditorium to give his traditional talk, because cats are beings that could see in the dark. And so he would offer a prayer to Bastet to be able to see in the darkness, which is something that I do myself. This Bastet statue is directly from Egypt. This was given to me by a hotel owner right near the Giza Plateau, and it came back in my suitcase with me, and got a little injury only here in the United States, made it safely through Egypt Air, and then got knocked over through a little household accident. But he's a very beloved fixture in my household. Um, I want to thank you all very much for being here. I know that there's a lot of different media resources and responsibilities making a very just claim for your time, and to spend a little bit of your time in exchange with me is something that I consider a real privilege and I value. So thank you. The theme of tonight's talk, non-human intelligences, is really one that I've never spoken on before. I suppose I've spoken on it in fragments, but it seemed an opportune time to speak on it more concertedly, especially since the theme of non-human intelligences is really roaring into our culture. People specifically are fascinated with the idea of otherworldly intelligences, whether they're ultra-terrestrial, that is to say, belonging to other dimensions, something that I'll be talking about more this evening, or whether they're extraterrestrial, coming from other solar systems, other galaxies. Um, and then there's also the question of non-human intelligences that we might encounter or that individuals report encountering as part of the spiritual search, whether beings encountered in the process of near-death experiences or various magical operations or ghostly visitations, apparitions, or cryptozoological encounters with beings that we might refer to as Bigfoot or Sasquatch or Yeti, or encounters with beings who populate the folklore of different nations, fairies or alushas or leprechauns or little folks. And in fact, the term non-human intelligences is so broad, maybe too broad, and that's something I'm going to come back to, that it might even include intelligences that we exist with side by side within our very evident and commonly observed terrestrial reality, like simians and dolphins. And there are also our ancient pre-sapient ancestors, such as Neanderthal men and women, who could be considered non-human intelligences. All of this wraps together, even if the term seems especially and uniquely broad. And of course, I must also add to that that some people feel that we're on the precipice of a human-made extra sapient intelligence in the form of AI or artificial intelligence, a term that is almost becoming so widely used. I tend to wonder whether we as a culture have really caught up to its implications as much as we read about it every day, and in fact, whether we've even defined the core term intelligence itself, and what the implications are of using a term so frequently and freely whose meaning has no consensus definition, even among 21st century thinkers, readers, seekers, scientists, and the general public. Um, I got interested in this question of the public exchange around non-human intelligences on the set of the show that I've been doing for Discovery, which Liz referenced, Alien Encounters, Fact or Fiction. Um, Doing the show, which is having its season finale this coming Wednesday night, was nothing less than a dream come true for me. I have been active as a writer, active as a speaker for many, many years, and for probably an equal number of years, been active with screen work. I think probably my first TV work was in 2007, 2 years before my book, my first book, Occult America, came out. I was on a History Channel special about prophecies surrounding the year 2012. And as a result of that, I was on a show that some of you may remember called The Montel Williams Show, which was a daytime talk show. And I've always enjoyed screen work enormously. And anybody who's worked in the development process for screen knows that, as I say with somewhat sardonic humor, it is a um, chaos-inducing experience, an experience of almost um, emotional whiplash that very frequently ends in crushing disappointment, because very few projects ever make it out of development, as any of you with us tonight who work in screen can well attest. I was joking with my friend Whitley Strieber and his now deceased wife Anne several years ago, and I said to Whitley jokingly that I could statistically prove that nothing ever actually gets filmed based on the development process. And it's not a tough statement to defend statistically, even though we're all obviously aware there are exceptions. It's funny though, years of work and effort that was filled with switchbacks, half starts, lots of TV work, but not the hosting role that I yearned for. Suddenly, and surprisingly, as things often play out in life, it all came together in a sudden flash, where in literally, gosh, it must have been December of last year, December of 2023. While I was visiting LA on other business, I was probably speaking at PRS. I received a call from a producer who was putting together cast and a host for this show, and it came together very, very quickly, having already been greenlit by the network. And I found myself in Roswell, New Mexico, the following February 2024, shooting. And we put together 7 one-hour episodes. And the show is based heavily upon reports from experiencers, which my colleagues and I evaluate and attempt to come to some sort of a reasonable jury decision to, on whether or not what was witnessed could be classified as unidentified. One of the things I noticed among many of the experiencers who came to the table um, was that a lot of the language that was getting used really bore the markings of our present generation. Um, so much so that any reasonable observer or participant in the query around alien life, let's say, or close encounters or unknown encounters or anomalous encounters, any reasonable observer has to take a breath and pay attention somewhat ruefully to the fact that many people use language that smacks of the popular culture. Many people use language that could almost be seen as a kind of off-the-shelf language, where somebody will talk about a gray, one of these aliens with the almond-shaped dark eyes that are familiar to so many of us today in the culture. It's probably the most familiar alien image, a being with this large cranium and spindly limbs and a expressionless face. That image was probably popularized by Whitley Strieber in his 1984 memoir of some kind of visitation encounter entitled Communion, and I'll be coming back to that. Or people might say tall gray or reptilian or something that is very much part of the lingua franca of popular culture at the moment. And there is a kind of pop culture repeat feedback loop that runs through some people's experiences. And that has to be taken note of. But when I take note of that, that doesn't necessarily disqualify from the validity of the person's encounter. Because it struck me as I was listening to many, many different witnesses, experiencers, many of whom were really very highly capable people, not infrequently, not infrequently, people with technical backgrounds, maybe an engineer, maybe a computer programmer, maybe a very experienced backyard astronomer, and there are backyard astronomers, as any scientist worth his or her salt can tell you, who have technical training that is absolutely impeccable. Um, some of the people were veterans, they had Air Force or Navy experience. Um, Many of them did some homework before they came to the table. They knew about satellite launches. They knew about software that tracked or reported different kinds of mundane aerial phenomena in the terrestrial skies. They knew about a very wide variety of disqualifiers uh, apropos of UFO or UAP experiencers. And they were very capable and canny people in many cases, in many cases. um, and I think it's almost it occurred to me that it's a given. It's a given that when we have anomalous encounters, um, we are almost certain to use language, examples, and archetypes that belong to our immediate generation and culture. And this came home to me when, during the course of the show, because of certain things that people were saying, I revisited a book that was published in 1893 by, of all people, President Teddy Roosevelt, who happened to be a very good writer, and it was called The Wilderness Hunter. It was a big 2-volume book of Roosevelt's experience in big game hunting all over the world. The ethical concerns around worldwide big game hunting were not acutely felt back in the 1890s because the extinction problem was not as pronounced. So trophy hunting, so to speak, wasn't controversial in the way that for some people it may be today. Although I'm not passing judgment on trophy hunters, there are a lot of animal reserves and such that are set aside actually for uh, sportsman activities. So I'm not rendering a judgment, but it's just something to mention. Anyway, Teddy was telling a story about hunting experiences that he had on the Idaho-Montana border. And at that time, even up to the late 19th century, the Idaho-Montana border was real hardcore wilderness. There might be a few Native Americans remaining in that area. There was very little development, very little trade. You maybe had some game paths, some trappers would pass through, and beyond that, this was hardcore wilderness of a kind that doesn't exist in too many places in North America anymore. And he told a really chilling story in this book um, about what we would probably refer to as a Bigfoot encounter. It's the most perhaps the most chilling Bigfoot encounter I've ever read. I certainly have returned to it several times. The story was told to Teddy Roosevelt by his guide, who was an old German American guide, who said that this encounter had happened to him in that same area several decades earlier when he was a young man. The guide had been out with a colleague or a friend of his, and they were doing some hunting and they were doing some trapping on this in this Idaho, Montana wilderness area. And they felt like they were being followed and being watched, and they could smell some really weird beast that they could not identify that seemed to be hanging around their camp. And it was extra frightening because the forest was covered with a very soft bed of pine needles. So you didn't even really hear footfalls, and it wouldn't be that hard for an animal or some kind of creature to sneak up on you. And one night, um, the trapper and his friend returned to camp after a day of hunting and setting traps, and they found that their camp had been ransacked. Their lean-to was knocked over, and their stuff was scattered all over the place. And they figured, oh, a bear came into our camp, and all right, now we have to repair the whole thing. So they repaired the whole thing, and it got dark. They made dinner. They had a fire lit, and one of the guys took an like a bright burning coal from the fire, or a brand, and he used it to follow the tracks that led away from their camp. And he came back, and he sort of stared into the fire for about 2 minutes, and he said to his partner, "Listen, whatever it was that destroyed our camp, that thing was walking on two legs." And the guy went, "Oh, come on, man, you're crazy." And they took another brand out of the fire, and they followed the tracks again, and they realized this thing was walking on two legs. And they were pretty creeped out. And they that night smelled this really rancid, awful odor around camp. And I guess this is where the expression "not happy campers" comes from, because they decided in the morning they were going to get out of there. They were seriously spooked. And these were experienced hunters. And so they split up their tasks. They decided one guy would strike camp, another guy would go check on some traps they had laid down by a river a little lower down from the area where they were staying. What was the Wisdom River, actually. It was the Wisdom River. Um, and so the one trapper went down to the Wisdom River, and he had some trouble with the traps. One of the beavers had dragged one of the traps into its uh, dam, the dam that the beaver had made. And he retrieved the trap, retrieved the beaver. He was occupied for several hours. And he came back to camp, and the sun was starting to set. And he found that his friend had been murdered, that his friend had been shaken back and forth, and there were four fang marks on his friend's neck. So his friend had been, wasn't eaten, but was shaken back and forth by this what obviously must have been a very powerful being, and had four fang marks on his neck. His throat had been torn open, and again, there was an unmistakable track marks of an upright being that had entered and left the camp, just as they had seen earlier. And he realized that there was something hovering around the camp, and he had his rifle with him, obviously, and he shot at it, and he thought he saw this big simian-like being, what we would call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And the being took off and ran, and the hunter, of course, gathered up his stuff, and even though it was near nightfall, got out of there as quickly as possible. What struck me about the story was not just its verisimilitude and its vintage, but the language that Teddy Roosevelt used. He called it a goblin encounter. Goblin is a term that sounds antiquated to us today, but it wasn't for several decades that the terms Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch would come into use. As it happens, in North America, from, let's say, the Canadian Yukon area down to the Pacific coast, let's say the coast of Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. There were well over 500 distinct Indian tribes, and each of these tribes had its own term for some sort of wild, unknown being, a man-like being dwelling in the woods. Now, why would Indian tribes from Portland, Maine to Eugene, Oregon, who had no traditional means of communication, all have that same terminology, a terminology that also exists in tribes that occupy the Arctic Circle. One of those tribes is known as the Cree. They're still there. Different Eskimo tribes, Inuit tribes, Tibetan indigenous people. They all have terms for a simian-like creature, and they're all different and they're all distinct terms. It would seem a damn big waste of time for people who had no means of communicating with one another, who had no common shared culture. These were distinct groups occupying different geography. We could, of course, have a wonderful evening discussing questions of extra-physical communication. I'm all for that, but for now, I'm going to stick with the pedestrian and say that none of these tribes per se had ways that we know of communicating, and they all had the same experience, frequently enough so that they all had a term and a name, just like we do, just like we do. We all have terms and names. Everybody here has some conception of what a goblin is, or what the boogeyman is, or what a fairy is, or what have you. Sure. But the names that we defer to much more frequently are names that are of this particular cultural moment. And so those terms and those names tend to run in the direction of, again, as I was saying earlier, an ET, a tall white, a gray, a reptilian. And yes, of course, we also use terms like Bigfoot and so forth. And if you go to a different region or a different part of the world, people will have their own terms for all these things. In Latin America, if you want to talk about little men who occupy the highlands and woods, they're called Aleutians. In England, fairies, fae folk. In Ireland, leprechauns, and so on and so forth around the world. There are terms in Africa. So it struck me as very possible that we're just drawing upon language that belongs to our generation, and that doesn't serve to discredit the reports of people who believe that they've had experiences, so much as we have to historically understand that we may all, it seems to me, I mean, this is the thesis of my talk tonight, that we may all be having the same conversation as we're trying to come up with some consensus language, vocabulary, profile for encounters that are not only as old as humanity, but, and I mean this very literally, and I'm going to be very clear about it, older than humanity, that are prehistoric. And this is what I mean. One of the extraordinary facts of the, I want to say the human story, but it's really, it includes the pre-human story, is the existence of some of the very forms that I've just been talking to you about among our pre-sapien, pre-human ancestors, specifically what is called Neanderthal men and women. Neanderthal men and women who predate our presence on this planet. They are, in some respects, our eldest known ancestors. Were not human beings in the strictest of sense. They were not Homo sapiens. They were Homo Neanderthal. They were different. They were different from us. They existed approximately from about 150,000 years ago to probably their point of extinction 40,000 years ago. And they bore a great similarity to us with differences. Their craniums were shaped very differently. They were more oblong than ours, which are more rounded and bulbous. So the brain matter that sat within their craniums obviously was different and was presumably possessed, as it must be, of a different biology, or at least differences in biology than the brain matter that we possess. And I have been very touched to discover, I've been very, very touched to discover that our Neanderthal ancestors, think of it, These are pre-human ancestors. These are not human beings. These are Homo neanderthals. Our Neanderthal ancestors possessed a spirituality, a belief in the coexistence of an extra physical world. Whenever I say spirituality, I really mean extra physical. And we know this because not only did our Neanderthal ancestors engage in what we would call arts and crafts, arts and sciences even, the making of tools such as hatchets, axes, hammers, spears, hunting apparatus. Um, but they also crafted talismans, necklaces, um, little statuary composed of eagle claws or bear claws, eagle talons or bear claws, which may have been um, more than just decorative, because everything I think had to be useful in a primeval society. Everything had to have a use. And these things may have been injunctions to unseen entities wishing for help with the hunt and help with fertility. One of the extraordinary things that we as a 21st century human community possess from our pre-human antiquity are these little statuettes. There are hundreds of them in museums around the world, which in the 19th century were given the somewhat hokey name of Venus statuettes. Venus statuettes. You see, we're using a Roman god, god of beauty, god of fertility, or a Greco-Roman god, to classify the activities of our pre-human ancestors, because what do? We reach off the shelf and we use terminology from our own era. That's what we as humans do all over the world. And so these so-called Venus statuettes are believed to be fertility talismans. You can find them online. They are round, bulbous, almost a Buddha-like statues, a certain kind of Buddha that you might have grown up with, seeing in restaurants and things. A certain hoary, happy, almost Santa Claus-like Buddha who is supposed to bring you good luck, and and these Venus statuettes are a feminine form, very bulbous, very broad, bulbous, broad breasts, bulbous, broad hips, and hundreds of them have survived from a a civilization that went extinct 40,000 years ago. And these things were small, maybe about 4.5 inches or so, and they could be carried around. They were portable, very important for a so-called hunter-gatherer society. Agriculture hadn't been fully developed yet, so you eat what you kill. And so people had to travel around, follow herds, follow migration patterns. Again, look how I defer to the language of our era. I'm saying people. They weren't people. They were Neanderthals, and they were our ancestors. They were our ancestors. And the Neanderthal civilization was a nomadic civilization by necessity, because they lived by the hunt. And so they apparently, based on what we are able to understand, would carry around these Venus statues as maybe a petitionary tribute, a petitionary appeal to those forces that could help with fertility. Survival was an everyday game. Life expectancy, very short. Maybe you'd make it to your 30s. Maybe if you were lucky, you'd make it to your 40s. Disease, hunger, animals preying upon different human groupings. occasional wars and breakouts of violence among people who might have been fighting over resources, the cold, the elements, very, very tough existence. And hence, life was so precarious. I don't think it's possible for us even to understand sometimes the brutality of life in the 19th century, much less among our pre-human ancestors. Their survival itself is extraordinary. So it stands to reason that fertility and the hunt were the chief concerns, and shelter too, of course, fertility, hunt, shelter, the chief concerns among a civilization attempting to survive. And nobody had time for speculation or nonsense, or there were no luxuries, there were no obvious wastes of time. What could you possibly do with yourself? There was a constant wish for survival, and they had apparently a spirituality. They had objects that we would recognize right off the bat as devotional objects. If I was to show a little statue of Bastet, whoops, I'm so sorry. We had a household accident with Bastet, but this is gonna be fixed. If I was to show a statue of Bastet to one of our ancient ancestors, I reckon that it would be conceivable to that being exactly what it was that was being shown. There's an extraordinary continuum, almost a universal language in the form of these talismans and statuettes that we would understand today. And it raises for me a remarkable question or prospect, and that is the following. Strict materialist skeptics of religion, strict physicalist philosophers of religion will usually tell you one of two things. Religion is or spirituality of whatever type is a mere byproduct of brain chemistry, brain biology. It soothes fears. It gives us a serotonin hit, or it gives us a dopamine hit. And there's always some headset wearing TED Talk expert, usually a neuroscientist, who will be delighted to tell you that certain parts of your brain electrically light up when you're making a spiritual appeal, or you think you're having some sort of a revelatory experience, and this coincides with the release of dopamine or serotonin. So we're just moist robots having a neurochemical experience, and that's that. That's one line of reasoning. Another line of reasoning is that we as human beings have various sociological, anthropological needs to believe that there's a big daddy somewhere that's looking out for us, and hence religion is nothing but a way of metaphorically keeping the lights on at night because we're frightened of the boogeyman. Okay. Those are the arguments, and there are ways that those arguments could be countered. But it seems to me, leaving aside all the kind of polemical partisan debates over all this stuff, that the Neanderthals themselves were presumably possessed of a different brain chemistry than ours, for the simple fact that their craniums were shaped differently. We know this. And there's no reason to assume that their neurochemical processes were the same as ours, nor was their culture the same as ours, affirming different kinds of religious belief, rewarding different kinds of religious belief. Of course, one could draw extrapolations between our 20th, 21st century cultures and their so-called prehistoric cultures and say, well, human, pre-human, we're all the same, but we don't know that. We don't know that. That's a supposition. What we do know is that they constructed apparent spiritual structures that ring so universally true and recognizable in terms of modern and pre-modern human practices that we could recognize them with the same immediacy that we might recognize a hatchet or a spear or another vital survival tool. And to me, it beckons the prospect that spirituality is neither biological nor cultural, but is realization. Because the culture and the biology of Homo sapiens versus Homo neanderthals is so vastly different, and in many respects, of course, unknown, that to witness the tools of an identifiable spiritual process among intelligent pre-human ancestors suggests realization, suggests universality, suggests that the common journalistic tropes or academic speculations about religion as a physicalist or materialist byproduct, epiphenomenon, or pathology of the human condition has this massive gaping hole in it, because we see a reach for the ineffable and a personification. Again, you'll have to forgive me because that's not quite the right term, but an individualized picturing of a deific force, personage, entity to which appeal can be made. The Neanderthals didn't look like the statuary that they made. They weren't bulbous. They were thin. They were contending with hunger. They were possibly emaciated at times, because in such a society, when you eat what you kill, there's no luxury of additional caloric intake. They were identifying something across vast stretches of Africa, Europe, Eurasia, the Far East, wherever we found Neanderthal remains. They were identifying like individualized, unseen beings to which an appeal could be made. And they were identifying within some of the game that they were seeking to hunt a kind of extra-physical coexistence that they thought could be summoned, beckoned, called to them. The occult formulation is as above, so below, or like attracts like, called to them by use of relic-like objects of some of the game that they were seeking to hunt. There are so many things that I could talk to you about with regard to stories and testimony and other things that touch upon perceptual studies, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But the historicism of pre-humanity and the shared commonality around spirituality, or belief in and appeal to, petition to the extra-physical, is an extraordinary part of the story of life on this terrestrial globe. Modern people have been fascinated for centuries with the question of extra-physical existence. And this has taken so many different forms. It took a certain form in the spiritualist era. It took many, many vast-ranging forms in antiquity, in civilizations that span the globe for millennia, literally. And in our own era, it takes a great many different forms. The one that has perhaps the keenest popularity today is the question of the alien life form. What is it? Why is it? Is it real? Is it fantasy? Is it imaginary? And so on and so forth. I mentioned Whitley Strieber and his wife Anne Strieber earlier. I first met Whitley, and we've worked together a while. Back in my publishing days, I published about 4 of Whitley's books, and I wrote an introduction to his most recent book, which is called Them. It's a good book. I recommend it. I first met Whitley in 2009 at a retreat at the Esalen Institute. It was just before my book Occult America came out, and it was a conference for people from a wide variety of different fields who study the metaphysical, the extra-physical, and so they got together people from the humanities, physics, seekers, kind of independent seekers like me, people who have written within the so-called UFO space like Whitley. And in preparation for the conference, I read Whitley's memoir, Communion, which I had never read before, and I was really enchanted with it. It's not only vivid and compelling, but it's very specific. It names places, dates, people, in a practice that I think people who write about the paranormal ought to make a point of following. And I saw he was standing out looking at the Pacific Ocean off this little patio in this meeting house where some of the guests were gathering. He was out there by himself. And I wanted to go out and say hello to him, so I opened up the door, and the waves were crashing into the rocky Pacific coast. So there was kind of this white noise, and you couldn't hear very well. And I walked out there, and his back was to me, and I wanted to say hello. And I said, "Excuse me, Whitley." And he almost jumped out of his skin. He jumped out of his skin. And it struck me at that moment that this is a man suffering from PTSD. It seemed to me that his encounters with unknown visitors had left him in a state of high anxiety. And he was struggling with the bodily trauma of a profoundly disturbing event, something that I think he would certainly attest to himself. And his wife, Anne, was still living at that time, very warm person. And Anne had taken it upon herself to catalog the many thousands of letters, literally thousands of letters, that Whitley had received in the wake of publishing Communion, of people who felt seen for the very first time in their lives, in their adult lives, who themselves had had alien encounters of some kind or another, and wanted to reach out to the Striebers as people who could understand this. And so Anne spent many years cataloging these letters, which are today archived at Rice University, thanks to Professor Jeff Kripal there. And Anne made a statement to Whitley one day, poring over all the letters. She said, "Whitley, whatever is going on amidst all these encounters, it has something to do with life after death. There's some kind of relationship between what the experiencers are reporting and life after death." And he believed, I think rightly, that there was a profundity in Anne's observation. And I suppose it speaks to the theme that I'm wrestling with this evening, which is that humanity and pre-humanity has been reporting encounters with unknown intelligences, let's say non-human intelligences, not only since the dawn of humanity, but since the dawn of pre-humanity. Hence, it seems to me, we should fall to our knees in front of that simple but undigestible, astonishing, awe-inspiring fact. We should fall to our knees in front of it. And that's why I think that although all of us, myself included, are going to keep using language that speaks to our time, place, and culture, we mustn't get hung up on this language. We must permit ourselves to be flexible about this language. I don't care whether someone says goblin or Bigfoot. I don't care whether someone says reptilian or gray or whatever. I mean, of course I care. I'm not trying to be glib. Different encounters have different folds, meanings, experiences, yes. But I don't want to get ourselves in the culture of search, hemmed into a kind of orthodoxy or hemmed into a kind of a repeat use of language that limits our ability to be flexible, to search, to morph, to change. I have a sympathy. I have a sympathy for these accounts, and I say that by way of disclosure. I say that in a cautionary way because it's a malady of human nature that all of us read preferentially. I read preferentially. Skeptics read preferentially. We write, we communicate preferentially. We believe what is in line with our perceived self-interest. And it is a malady of human nature. And anybody who thinks that he or she is free of it is probably the worst offender among us. It's a very serious blind spot in human nature. So it's very difficult to get to any kind of intelligent consensus around any of this. But I must say the following, and I ask that you hear this very clearly. The philosophies known as materialism or physicalism in their strictest senses have expired. They've expired intellectually, even though they're dominant culturally. And it's very, very important to be watchful for this, because I think it's an important pivot point in our modern human story. The philosophy of materialism, which has held sway in the Western world for perhaps 300 years or so, holds that everything is an epiphenomena of matter, that matter creates itself, that everything is a chemical process, that your thoughts, whatever they are, whatever a thought actually is, are just like bubbles in a carbonated glass of water. And when the water is gone, the bubbles are gone, and that's that. Well, that philosophy is obsolete. It doesn't hold up. It no longer covers the bases of observation in 20th and 21st century life. Excuse me as I perform a materialist process. And it is a very compelling philosophy to much of academia, much of our therapeutic culture, and much of the irrigation channels from those worlds, most especially mainline media or opinion-making mainstream media. And these philosophies are compelling because they work up to a point, but no one questions the limits of their empiricism. I'm speaking colloquially, of course. Lots of people question the limits of their empiricism, but very few people who contribute to the parapsychology articles on Wikipedia, very few people who work at opinion making or once upon a time opinion making media. Very few people within the academic humanities and social sciences. There's a great deal more liberalism in the hard sciences and medicine. Very few people who participate in the therapeutic culture, with exceptions. Some of those exceptions might be with us tonight. And the contention that everything is matter and that matter creates itself and that everything you experience is an epiphenomena of matter has failed in the face of world-class science. The founders of quantum theory themselves were philosophical idealists. The founders of world-class modern hard science were philosophical idealists. In other words, they believed in a perceptual dimension or component or premise to reality, that human perception was not just a matter of prejudice or bias or preordained thinking, but it was an actual correlative or causative tool in determining what appears in actual reality. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The founders of the most compelling modern philosophy, which would be idealism, were in direct agreement, as it happens, with the founders of particle physics and quantum theory, which is to say, Kant, Hegel were of the belief for which they argued with the most assiduous logic that reality was a product of human perception, sensory data that not only allowed us to interpret the world, but proved determinative of the world, not just interpretation, but positive, causative action arose from perception, not just in terms of cognition or motor skill. I wish to pick up this, or I wish to, move this over there, but actual concretization of experience based on measurement, based on sensory data. I'm going to try to give a quick example of what I am saying. I'm not giving a talk tonight on quantum physics and metaphysics, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least try to accurately encapsulate the chief insight that we as a modern community have been able to extract from the field of particle physics, and it is this. And what you're going to hear is something that I would say on any podium, at any conference, in front of any audience, and I stand upon the basic accuracy of these terms, general though they are. The field of particle physics, now approaching a century old, has found that minute matter, pre-atomic particles, but not particles that small alone, because quantum experiments have been done with larger and larger objects, including hydrogen molecules, for example. But the classical field is based in subatomic particles, which exist in a so-called wave state, or a state of superposition, until measurement is taken. It is only when measurement is taken, that this unit of matter occupies an actual definable place, is localized, is real, is concrete. until a measurement is taken within the field of particle physics. The concretization is only a probability. It's only a possibility, drawing upon infinite possibilities while matter is in a state of superposition, while particles, subatomic sometimes, but not always, are in a state of superposition. And when measurement is taken, this state collapses, so to speak, to one definite place. Now, some people in the field of physics and the field of chemistry will object to the language that I'm using and say, for example, there's no such thing as a wave state. What you're talking about is a wave function, and it's just a mathematical formula. A wave function is the square root of probability. In other words, a wave function, when squared, will give you the probability of where a particle is going to wind up. And that is true. That is true. And it's extraordinary enough because we don't know why. Why would infinity squared give us probability? We don't know. We only know that it kind of sort of works, which is why it's accepted, because it's replicated. But the fact is, that's a willfully narrow interpretation of an extraordinary operation that is not just a mathematical formula, but is an actually physically observed phenomena. We can tell through what are called interference patterns that particles occupy, not metaphorically, but actually, an infinite number of places until measurement is taken, thereby localizing the particle to one place, before which it exists only as a possibility. It is only when an observer or a device, like a photometer, takes a measurement, doesn't matter whether it's a person taking the measurement or an automatized device taking the measurement, the only thing that creates actuality is that measurement. These are the facts of the field, whoever likes it or not. And it stands to reason. In fact, it is demanded by reason that infinite outcomes and possibilities are coexistent. When is the measurement taken? Well, Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Okay. What if it was, taken at 3:01? Well, it's a whole different set of possibilities that occur. This also has something to do with what is called chaos theory. This particulate difference creates a reality different from a reality that would exist or would not exist had no measurement ever been taken, or had a measurement been taken 8 hours later, or 8 seconds later, or 1 second later, or whatever. It is a logical necessity. It is a logical necessity that infinite coexistent outcomes, infinite simultaneous outcomes, exist ever and always all around us. And what we call reality is measurement. What are our senses, our so-called 5 senses, but tools of measurement? We taste, we touch, we sense distance, perspective. We pick up vibrations, we define them. It's measurement. It's measurement. So a natural law, a law in order to be a law, must be universally consistent. Doesn't mean it works the same way every time, not at all. Gravity doesn't work the same way every time. It changes based on mass. Again, whatever gravity is. Gravity seems to be mass attracted to itself. It exists in the vacuum of space, where distant objects possessed of mass are slowly but inextricably drawn together by what we call gravity. We don't know what it is. We're describing an effect. There's no theory of gravity. We describe empirical effects. Okay. Water It's always H2O, but it could be a vapor, a liquid, a solid, depending upon surrounding circumstances, which we call temperature. So there's no reason to accept that a natural law, while it is ever operative, is always going to be the same way. But it does have to be ever operative, as above, so below, as Hermeticism told us. What occurs on a micro scale must occur on a macro scale, even if there are very significant and palpable differences in what occurs based on surrounding circumstances. But if we're witnessing actuality born of measurement on a particle level, and again, experiments have been occurring with larger objects, proteins, hydrogen molecules, it stands to reason that that phenomena doesn't just go away in our above ground macro world. And it stands to reason that the logical necessity of simultaneous outcomes might announce itself, might express itself, might exist under the rubric of terms that we use, like different dimensions or different intersections of time. This is what string theory is all about. String theory postulates that everything that is a thing exists on these undulating bands of strings, which is why there's a so-called mirror effect, not only within particle physics, but within macro astronomy as well, something observed by Sir Isaac Newton himself, that objects at a distance seem to affect one another with no evident, obvious point of connection. This is what Einstein somewhat derisively referred to as spooky action at a distance. Well, string theory is a conceptualized model of reality that seeks to explain why things with no obvious connection affect one another, because these different dimensions or intersections of time all exist along these undulating bands of strings, and something that might be happening in one of these intersections of time that we don't necessarily see commonly is affecting stuff that's going on in the world that we do commonly see. And it could be, and I'm just making a leap of supposition here, but I think it's a reasonable leap, to the extent that I think what I've explored provides a sufficient enough springboard to sustain this leap. It could be that this vast millennia spanning record of encounters that we possess, going from our pre-human ancestors up right through today, maybe consists of some of us getting glimpses of, experiencing things that do simultaneously coexist with us along different strings or bands of reality, different intersections of time, different dimensions. The computer scientist and UFO theorist Jacques Vallée reasoned that actually aliens, ETs, might more likely be explained as beings who are interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. And I'm very sympathetic to that point of view, because the fact is, we have better conceptual models, some of which I've just been describing, of interdimensionality than we do of extraterrestriality. The real tough aspect of the extraterrestrial thesis is spanning these vast distances, How could it be done? Can something move faster than light? Because even light speed is insufficient for there to be any kind of real interstellar contact. Well, we have theories that There are things that are referred to as cosmic wormholes, and the theory is if you introduce some piece of exotic matter into space, you may be able to create a portal where time-space collapses. We know that time bends. We know Einstein was right, that time is not an absolute. Time itself is conceptual. We experience linear time as an absolute reality. And yes, it's overwhelmingly persuasive and I presume overwhelmingly necessary, but it ain't ultimate reality. Time bends at or near the velocity of light speed. And in fact, as I've mentioned previously, astronauts in our own era, even though they're moving nowhere near the velocity of light, do demonstrate minute but measurable reductions in the aging process. It's surreal, but true, but factual. Just like gravity, just like electricity, just like a wave state, or if my purist friends insist, a wave function, that only concretizes into reality upon observation. We don't know why, but we know that it is. We know that it is. So my contention, given that our interdimensional models are better worked through than our intergalactic models or our interstellar models, my contention is that all of these encounters, all of these reports, all of this testimony, and yes, all of this evidence, I'm going to get to that in 1 second, points to the possibility that we are experiencing beings from different intersections of time or different dimensions or different bands of string. And believe me, they may be just as freaked out to see us as we are to see them. You know, we're always assuming, we as a human community are always assuming, oh, this is purposeful. They're coming with an environmental message. They're coming for this. They're coming for that. They may be like, who the fuck are these beings? You know, and they want to get out of here, you know, as much as we want to get out of their way. I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm just sort of you know, talking kind of friend to friend at this point, but I do believe that these are real possibilities that our generation ought to be grappling with for a very particular reason, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Now, evidence. By the way, I just want to say a little quick and fast word about evidence. There are insistencies that even impressive as the current crop of high-def video and radar-based evidence is for UFOs, it's not enough. The benighted Neil deGrasse Tyson says, hey, you abductees, next time you're abducted, come back with an ashtray, and then I'll believe you. Well, people have come back with an ashtray, so to speak. People have come back with an ashtray, so to speak. In 2010, actually it was December of 2009, the Defense Intelligence Agency released a report, which you can find online in PDF at a .gov site, which disclosed that Air Force and Navy personnel were displaying signs of bodily trauma, including radiation burns, after flyovers by objects, aerial objects of unknown technology. And when I read this, my jaw fell open. I thought to myself, this is as close to a holy grail of UFO reportage and marshaling of concrete physical evidence as anything that we've ever seen. It is, to my mind, equally momentous to the wonderful epic shaping reportage done by Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper on the cover of the New York Times in 2017 about the Pentagon maintaining a previously undisclosed UFO tracking program and the verification of cockpit footage of the so-called Tic Tac UAP. This 2010 recently declassified Defense Intelligence Agency report documented physical evidence in the form of bodily trauma and specifically radiation burns on the bodies of Air Force and naval personnel following flyovers, and I'm very closely paraphrasing, by objects, aerial objects of unknown technology. That is a plain, clear acknowledgement of UFO activity, now close to 15 years old, leaving empirical evidence in the form of radiation burns identified as such by military medical professionals. Of course we have physical evidence. Of course we have physical evidence. On the show Alien Encounters, there was a geologist, Frank Kimbler, who is a earth scientist and an associate professor of geology at New Mexico Military Academy, who came on the show, and he felt that he had found an unexplained metallic fragment at the alleged Roswell crash site. We tested it and found that, in fact, according to the lab report that we received, the object was composed of a pure aluminum, that it showed impact, that it showed markings of manufacture, that it showed damage from combustion explosion, but that it was pure aluminum, which was very unusual because pure aluminum is it's too flexible, it's too unstable. It's not an alloyed compound. Aluminum in its pure form is not used for manufacturing simply because it's too unstable. So Frank, who is himself a trained geologist, found this fragment at the alleged crash site. And although it shows signs of manufacturing impact and combustion explosion, it's made of a material that is not used anywhere in our industrial society for manufacturing, aerial or otherwise. And Frank further explained to me that the lab report found that a very small atomic measurement below the surface shows an aluminum alloy of unknown compound. Now, this is something that I haven't studied, and further tests need to be done, specifically radiation tests, to determine whether this particle that Frank found has an extraterrestrial origin. It's obviously not that unusual that extraterrestrial objects strike Earth. I'm wearing one myself. This stone is moldavite, which comes from a meteor that crashed some 10,000 years ago in what is now Eastern Europe. But the point I'm trying to get at now, by the way, the radiation tests were unaffordable for us. They cost about $7,000. Not a huge sum of money. If somebody wants to slap down a credit card and do it, it's a damn good way of forwarding pure questioning. In science, it does destroy the particle. And I'm hopeful that funds will soon become available to perform a radiation test on Frank's particle. The barriers are not that high, and this is the kind of thing that helps the conversation. But I say this not to get lost in a tangent, but to say to you that we have verified physical evidence. We have high def cockpit and radar footage. We we have radiation burns on military personnel following a dead to rights description of UFOs, and this is just that data and material that has been disclosed. But we have it. We have it. And so we need to sort of move the conversation beyond these glib remarks and start to ask, well, um, are we going to test this evidence further? Are we going to properly fund and pursue the field on significantly serious enough grounds so that we can test and gather more? And what will we learn? I couldn't begin to say, other than the fact that it's a misnomer, and it's a kind of a canard to say, in fact, that we have no physical evidence, ashtray or not. Now, I want to wrap up because I want to leave us time for exchange, and we're getting half past the hour. And I want to say the following, um, and that is, why should any of this matter? Why should any of this matter? I suppose one could always say, well, pure questioning requires no justification, and I certainly agree with that. It should not be, and I apologize if I've ever contributed to this, I'm sure I have, should not be a partisan matter. This is not about making me feel good or waving a flag for my team or your team. There's something else at stake, and I'm not going to get into any great flowery statements about the meaning of life or the infinite nature of man, and I could certainly talk about the latter, and I care about it, but I'm going to say the following. About a year ago, I was in the city, the very beautiful city of Barcelona in Spain, and we went to the National Art Museum in Barcelona, and they had a wonderful, wonderful exhibit on the work and writings of the French libertine writer, the Marquis de Sade. And the Marquis de Sade, as some of you know, was a French scandalous libertine writer, born in 1740, died in 1814, and was known for his sexual explorations, his relaxation and evasion of social standards, his interest in all kinds of scandal making, rumor mongering, and sexual exploration, and his literary grace. His explorations inspired directly and indirectly many different generations of artists, and the purpose of this exhibit at Barcelona was not only to provide some primary materials, letters, journals, drawings from the Marquis's life, but was also to frame and explore the work of artists who were inspired by him directly or indirectly, ranging from George Bataille to Genesis P. Orridge. And it was a wonderful exhibit. And I have only good things to say about the curators, the nature of the exhibit, the quality of the work of the different artists who were included in it. But I have to say the following. There was something musty about it. There was something about it that seemed to belong to yesterday. I didn't feel scandalized, and I suppose you could say, look, well, once something reaches the point of being exhibited in a museum, it's no longer transgressive by its nature. Okay, okay. But the point of a lot of the different artists, the visual artists, the writers, the photographers, the movement artists that were included in this exhibit was that they were somehow transgressing societal norms, the same way that the Marquis de Sade once did. And yet, for an exhibit dedicated to violative forms of expression, it felt long in the tooth. It felt musty. It felt old. And I realized that so much of the premises behind the artwork and behind the curatorial notes that accompanied the exhibit were based in materialist philosophies, a certain kind of mainline Freudianism. Sigmund Freud himself was very interested in extra-physical philosophies, specifically telepathy and clairvoyance, something that I'll be talking about on the podcast that I'm doing entitled Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. So there were many different Freuds, but there was a kind of mainstream materialist, trauma-based, neurosis-based, repression-based Freud that underscored some of the art. There is the Marxist analysis that looks for frictions of a strictly materialist nature, defining our lives, defining our societies. Once upon a time, these frictions were thought to be strictly economic. And then when that didn't work out in the 20th century the way everybody had planned, these frictions shifted from being economic to being cultural. And so lettered culture started invoking the qualities of the other, the outsider, who would cause friction within a society. Other premises included existentialism, humanity's fear of death, humanity's confrontation with its own demise, and of course there was a wish for and a imperative among the different artists and the curators' notes to bust up power structures. But these power structures that were being described all really came back to existentialism, Freudianism, Marxism, in different variants to be sure, but those were the baseline premises. And I thought, this so belongs to yesterday, it seems to me. What's missing here is a conception of human life that encompasses the extra physical. This is the missing artery. It's not an endpoint. It's a new channel. It's a door. And it's funny that I should be saying this, since I have been describing a spirituality, an extra physicality, a non-locality, an ultra form of existence that goes back to prehistoricism. And yet, that is the great undigested verity of human nature. And modernist philosophy, materialist philosophy, reigning so successfully and having its many victories for 300 years, has so settled into the firmament of our institutions, therapeutically, academically, in terms of opinion shaping media, the culture of letters, that the notion of the extra physical is, among all different antecedents of life, the excluded notion. That is to say, within these edifices, academia, therapia, media, within all of these institutions, in their dominant expressions, including reference media like Wikipedia, in their dominant expressions, exclude the very possibility, the very question of non-human intelligence, of the so-called alien encounter, of the extra-physical, of the non-local. And I contend that we are kind of now, as a human community, running in circles, chasing our tail, talking about artificial intelligence when we haven't even defined intelligence itself. What is it? If, as seen in the field of neuroplasticity, a thought, whatever that may be, affects the neural structure of your brain, affects the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel in your brain, then what is a thought? And is it something that can be artificially created? Ought we even be using the term intelligence? These are questions, but they're questions that go unasked in a mature, sustained, and serious way within the dominant institutions of our culture. Hence, rather than knocking on the door again and again of the dominant institutions, we need, I believe, we as a seeking community need our own institutions like this one, the Philosophical Research Society, where we can explore these things in this way tonight, because we're not going to get very far. If we bruise our knuckles just banging on the door again and again of the mainstream institutions, we need new settings, new gatherings, new places for the human community to discuss these things in a sustained, compelling, and broad-reaching way. Not because I want to win or wave my flag for this side or that side or the other side, but rather because there's a depression, there's an ennui, there's a feeling of exhaustion in our culture. And it's because we've excluded this verity of human existence. So my wish tonight for myself and for all of you who have been good enough to join in this exchange is that we explore, we seek, we not get held up by language, we not get held up by glibness, we unplug from people, institutions, settings, situations that stymie rather than foster the search. And we honor this generational moment where we face a kind of new day in terms of human inquiry, because our physicalist and materialist philosophies, they've exhausted themselves. They failed at this juncture intellectually to cover all the myriad bases of life. And we are, as a human seeking community, going to be playing catch up for a while. These next 30 years, for those of us who are here to see them, I might just make it, are going to be an interesting time because there are new verities, defensible, mature, sustainable, bubbling up from the human story, many of them very ancient, coming back to us today. And these new verities are going to require probing and exploration so that we can move the human story forward and not get stuck with philosophies and outlooks that belong in a museum. But let's create new horizons rather than new museums. And I thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm very grateful. And I've set aside time, even though we're past time. I'm going to stick around. And I'd love to hear from you and hear what some of your questions are. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Mitch. That was excellent as always. A lot for us to chew on for sure. So very happy that this will be recorded, and a reminder that if you were not able to join us for the whole thing or weren't able to join us here, it will be available for all ticket purchasers in time. So do be patient with us. We have quite a lot going on at PRS, thankfully, but we will try and get that to you as soon as possible. All right, Mitch. So we do have an active chat going on, and I'm going to start with the very first questions. I'll go in order. And the first is actually not a question, it's a statement from Sarah, who said, on what Mrs. Stryber said about life after death, I have seen exactly one ghost and one UFO. Both were on the same night. So
On the same what?
on the same night.
Oh, how interesting.
All right, so we have from Wit, could you elaborate on your idea of an ancestral encounter?
Well, um, I think I know who's asking this question, and hey, um, I think we, I think we find it easier to relate to the unseen in within the framework that we were raised, and that framework, it seems to me, could be ancestral. My background religiously is Jewish. When I was a kid, I grew up in a traditional Jewish household and had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. And sometimes I've thought to myself, as much as I like to describe myself as some radical seeker, maybe I'm always just deferring backwards to childhood. Maybe I'm always just deferring backwards to the Abrahamic God, the monotheistic God of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Be good and you'll get a break. Be bad and you'll get the old smackdown. And then I thought to myself at a certain point, So what? So what? I mean, that way of viewing the world is so baked into me. And the truth is, maybe it's no better, no worse than any other way of viewing the world. I mean, there may be individuals who don't come from that background, who have a polytheistic background. Polytheism is certainly my outlook today. Um, there may be individuals who participate in cultures that are much more free flowing, um, less analytic than the one I'm accustomed to. And it seems to me, a rose by any other name is just as sweet. Um, we're all grounded in certain ways of viewing the world. And I think that a lot of extraordinary things can happen within those different groundings, and maybe they shouldn't be struggled against too much. They're just kind of part of who we are. Um, Culture does obviously play a role. You don't want it to become a trap, but if it provides a certain lexicon, so what? I think that's wonderful. So it could be that somebody from, let's say, a Celtic background, might experience things that announce themselves in that way, just as somebody from a Inuit background would experience things that announce themselves in that way. And again, we could all be encountering these ultra beings from different um, intersections of time, dimensions, bands of string, as I was describing, and we're looking for words, or we're seeing things perhaps that are defined by conceptualized ideas that we grew up with, or maybe that we inherited, sometimes going way back. And it seems to me that that might uh, temper and refine some of the experiences that we're having. I don't think it detracts from them at all. It's just the lens, so to speak, the device, through which we're seeing.
I think this is a good follow-up also from Wit on what you just spoke about. How has the idea of life after death brought you to your knees, and has it altered how you perceive mortality?
That's a wonderful question. I don't I'm 58 years old, and I'm keenly aware of the fact that the phone call is coming one day. I mean, there's just no escaping that. If I'm here for the next 30 years and doing well, I'll count myself as lucky. So I'm not fleeing from thoughts of mortality. Thoughts of life after death have always been a very um, undefined area for me. Um, I've been influenced by thinkers who are very undefined about life after death. For example, the 20th century philosopher G.I. Gurdjieff is a major influence on me. Um, Gurdjieff's outlook was that we didn't something survives, but that the individual has been rendered so automatized by modern life that the man and woman of today, as he saw it, today, broadly speaking, needs to work to develop a so-called soul, that we don't have this finer self. One needs to work to develop this finer self. We are, as Gurdjieff saw it, automatons. Hence, we look around the world and there's war, there's disaster, and there's all these problems which are absolutely solvable. And we all talk about solving them, especially on social media, and nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. And the individual needs to work to develop that thing, that finer self that we call a soul. Um, Madame H.P. Blavatsky had a view of the afterlife very close to traditional Vedic theology, which is that the individual joins this life stuff, this greater life stuff. And there is transmigration, but not in any kind of individual form. It's almost like we go back to the fertilizer mill, so to speak, and life emerges from what we call us, I, but it's no longer us, I. It's impersonal. It's an impersonal process. Um, Judaism too doesn't place a huge emphasis on afterlife. So I've never really, it doesn't really pulsate in me. It doesn't pulsate in me. And I think other people, perhaps the questioner, him or herself, has a richer feeling, approaching that afterlife. Now, it could be, look, it could be that we all, human beings and pre-human beings, have a extra physical existence. And someone might experience that through what is called near-death experience or life after death or extra bodily survival. Someone might experience that through what is called ESP or clairvoyance or telepathy. Somebody might experience that through a so-called UFO or alien encounter. They're all valid. They're all real. They all speak to that truth. But again, it becomes like lenses, devices through which we see. So I think those devices are to be encouraged. They're not to be replaced. They're not to be fought against. It just might depend upon individual proclivity.
Great. Well, we have a little bit more of a specific question here from Zachary. Mitch, any insight on Macungas? I believe it's Chicano.
Say again, I'm sorry.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly. So, Zachary, if you know the pronunciation, you can correct me. But do you, Mitch, have any insight on Macungas? And he says, I believe it's Chicano.
Oh, I guess, are you speaking of like West African or Afro-Caribbean religious tradition?
Zachary, do you want to elaborate on that?
Pick it up later. Sorry.
All right, we'll circle back on
Okay.
that one. Maybe I can do a little Wikipedia search real quick too. Okay, so we have from
We'll put the
Sandra.
statistics point of view on Wiki.
Yeah. From Sandra, we have Mitch, what are your thoughts about the timing of the US government finally acknowledging the existence of UFOs slash UAPs? And how do you think this contributes to the evolution of our understanding of extraterrestrial life outside of our planet slash dimension?
Well, timing is always an interesting question. How does an idea go viral? Why was 1947, for example, the year in which the people started seeing flying saucers? First in Washington State, then New York, Los Angeles, Washington D.C. By 1948, 1949, everybody knew what a flying saucer is. Likewise, 100 years earlier, why was 1948, sort of a symmetrical, I'm sorry, 1848, sort of symmetrically almost by century? Why was that the year of spiritualism, where Kate and Margaret Fox in upstate New York, not far from where I'm seated, told mom and dad that they were hearing spirit raps in the cabin, and by, within a couple of years, some 10% of Americans were participating in spiritualism or talking to the dead. It's so mysterious. Why? Why does an idea go viral at that moment? Now, in the UFO community, one of the problems in the UFO community is partisanship. There is so much partisanship. I mean, if you want to take a break, you should get into politics. It's more restful. It's more relaxing. There's so much partisanship in the UFO community. And the notion being that everything is an op, everything is a trick, everything is designed to snooker people, and idiots like Mitch Horowitz go out talking about aliens and UFOs, and they're just useful, unknowing idiots to the grand conspiracy that only some guy on Twitter knows about. And the fact is, we slice and dice ourselves up, too much into these partisan insistencies that the government disclosed it right now to disguise this or this plan or that plan. Or I think there's more of a kind of how shall I put it? I almost want to defer to the language of Hermeticism and say that some kind of overmind, call it nous, call it infinite intelligence, call it non-local intelligence, call it culture, call it an idea going viral, a term coined by my friend Douglas Rushkoff. There's some cultural phenomenon that ushers in these things, regardless of what other details, and there may be many, are going on simultaneously. Why are we living in what seems to be an age of disclosure, if I can use that cultural language? It's really difficult to say. I know there are individuals, certainly, who move the ball down the field. I mentioned three of them earlier: Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper. I mean, the reportage that trio did, I think, is heroic. Of course, again, in the UFO community, some people think, aha, you're just a shill and a mouthpiece for the forces that are directing those poor deluded fools. And there's too much of that stuff going on within the UFO world. In a way, I'm an in-law or an outsider to the UFO world. I'm interested in it with deep passion, but I don't belong to any particular team. And I think that beginner's mind, as they call it in Zen Buddhism, can be very, very helpful. So why there is disclosure at this moment, why we're getting declassified, Defense Intelligence Agency reports, allowing, for the partisanship that exists around that, why is that happening now? I think is a much broader cultural question. I would say this: Gary Nolan, the Stanford University biophysicist, who has done some really fascinating and wonderful work dealing with the memory patterns of experiencers, and the question of whether some of us have a constitutional proclivity towards experiences of what might be called anomalous encounters. Gary makes the point, which I think has to be heeded. It's just such good sense that when it comes to disclosure, when it comes to whistleblowers, when it comes to government witnesses, so on and so forth, there are as many different motives as there are people. There are good players, there are bad players, there are good, honest actors, there are untrustworthy actors. And that is a fact of human nature that I have seen play out across every field that I've ever been part of, from finance to spirituality. There are good actors and bad actors, and there are good motives and bad motives. And the deeper question for me, and I can only frame it, is why? Why did these cultural moments happen? Why was there such a wave of interest in spiritualism in the mid-19th century? Now, as a matter of fact, I did give a talk several months ago at PRS. In fact, it may have been at the very time that I was contacted about the show Alien Encounters, where I talked about this hidden hand theory behind the occult, and this idea that there were vested interests of an esoteric nature who wanted to counter the materialist narrative in the mid-19th century, and things got out of control, and Madame Blavatsky was sent to put everything back in the box, but she had designs of her own, and things got even more out of control. And it's a very, very interesting through line in esoteric literature, which I talk about in a lecture that you can find online at PRS's website channel and my own. I believe it's called The Hidden Hand Theory of the Occult. Anyway, that was my attempt in a speculative way to question why spiritualism emerged in the mid-19th century. Why is disclosure, emerging? Well, for example, why 100 years later did the modern UFO narrative emerge through Kenneth Arnold and sightings in DC, New York, LA? Why? Why now are we going through this, what seems to be this jumpstart of disclosure? It's fascinating. It's fascinating. The reasons may get written long after we're gone. That was, but I made a similar attempt in that lecture that I was just referencing.
I have heard rumblings that there's speculation that between next year and 2027, there's meant to be some sort of massive collective encounter, and that's why they're preparing us for
Well, I certainly hope so,
possibility.
because I said last week on Alien Encounters that 2024 is the year of disclosure. I must have been caught in a moment of a great enthusiasm. I certainly said it with integrity, but when I watched it, I thought, Okay, buddy, that's going to be around forever. So,
All right, so from Sandra as well, this is also a recommendation for you potentially. Mitch, are you aware of the book The Tahunga Canyon Contacts by Anne Druffel from 1980?
no.
Okay, well, this is a true account of 5 women abductees who lived in and near Tahunga Canyon, an active area right here in the foothills of Los Angeles. This is a credible book by an early UFO researcher. Years ago, Anne came to speak to our historical society in La Crescenta, California, and told the humorous story of how her book was once the most stolen book from Bolton Hall, the Sunland Tahunga Library and Museum. She also wrote the chapter on how to resist or survive being abducted by aliens in the book Worst Case Scenario Survival Handbook. So
And this was the most stolen book at this community library. So, were these devotees of Abby Hoffman, or was somebody trying to silence it? I do want to read it very much, and I thank you for that. And we have the recording, and I will make note of that, and I will read that. Thank you.
yeah, that's a great recommendation, Sandra. All right, so from Klon, we have what has been the most astounding UAP report you've read lately?
Well, for me personally, the most astounding was the events that I was referencing in the 2010 Defense Intelligence Agency report, which can be found online. I was so blown away by it that when it was first sent to me, I was sure somebody was pranking me, and then I found otherwise. Frank Kimbler's evidence has been very meaningful to me because I've held it in my hands. We had on the show a woman named Jessica Blunt, who likewise had bodily lacerations. She's from Utah. She had an encounter experience, and Jessica described and provided images of lacerations that were suggestive of what was seen in that defense report. So I would say those are the 3 that have been most interesting to me recently.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, if that's all right, Mitch.
Totally fine.
All right, so from Mary, we have, I'm curious about the regions around the world that seem to have hyperactive interdimensional or paranormal activity. What are your thoughts on why these specific areas experience such intense phenomena? And then we have a follow-up from Alex on that same question. Curious about this as well. I have seen phenomena in an area that fits exactly what others have seen there, and someone with me witnessed what I saw. Most people describe it as extraterrestrial life. I am open to a different explanation, maybe nature spirits, but seems like the same has been experienced by others in that particular mountain.
So I guess this is a question really of portals in a way, or are there hotspots or areas that are um, uniquely attracting of or are a kind of porous in a way that might allow experiences to occur that might not occur as you're walking down the street of any city. That's, I think, a very, very um, dominant and persuasive observation. Here in New York State, where I live, the Hudson Valley has been known as one of those hot spots. Um, Obviously, there are other areas of the United States, from Hawaii to Sedona, that are known as those hot spots. Los Angeles itself, Southern Cali itself, is considered such a hot spot. I think that so many modern thinkers have asked themselves the question, what is it about California? What is it about the Pacific coast that not only seems conducive to encounters, but of so much that is um, novel and new and reforming, of religion, of spirituality, of human potential, of the human experience? Is it Native American energies? Is it something else? I will tell you this. Forgive me because I'm being a little indirect towards your question, but I hope it's helpful. Madame Blavatsky, writing in The Secret Doctrine in 1888, made the observation back at a time when Southern California was a cow town, literally, she made the observation that humanity is experiencing, as she saw it, a leap um, from as she saw it. We are the I'm going to get deep into theosophy for a second. I promise it'll only be a second. We are the fifth subrace of the fifth root race, and there's this subrace leap from fifth to sixth that's going to play out in the centuries immediately following the publication of Secret Doctrine. And she said that it's in the Pacific Rim and Southern Cali in particular that this transformation will take place. And it was a remarkable, foresightful statement, because Southern Cali at that time was agricultural. You know, you had the gold rush, you had orange groves, you had some mining going on, you had some railroads and shipping going on, but it was an agricultural town. It was a ranch town. It was a cow town. Why would that be the birthplace of the New Age? Until it was. So there are these geographical hotspots. It's really hard to explain. In the mid-19th century, central New York State, the area called the Burned Over District, which is this snaking stretch of land in between Buffalo in the west and Albany in the east, gave birth to an unbelievable number of new religious movements: spiritualism, Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, social movements like suffragism, perfectionism, utopianism, all this stuff. And if you drive through the area today, it's pretty remarkably preserved. There's some sprawl, but it's pretty remarkably preserved. It's greenery, it's beautiful rolling hills in the summertime, the climate and the atmosphere. It's a lot like southern France. You'd ask yourself, what was so magical here? It's beautiful, to be sure, but what engendered this? And it's as fascinating a question of how ideas go viral. But there are areas of geography. One thing I have noticed is wherever you see migratory patterns, you see new religious movements, and there are reasons for that. But still, the foresight with which Blavatsky saw Southern Cali as becoming this epicenter of the New Age, it's remarkable, and people have wondered this throughout the 20th and now 21st centuries. What is it about Southern and Northern California? I mean, of course, you can come up with a bevy of explanations sociologically and in terms of climate and so forth and so on, all valid. But I think a lot of different things are coexisting at once, and it seems to me that these so-called hotspots do exist.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Especially as a local LA native from the San Fernando Valley, we have some very interesting hotspots here as well that also connect to the indigenous peoples who have been here very long before too. So
Yes.
always fascinating. All right, so our last question slash comment for you, and thank you everyone who has stuck around, and
Thank you.
obviously thank you, Mitch. All right, so from Kristen, although I could venture to guess, I'm interested to hear your perspective on as to why people that do some form of magical with a K or occult practices tend to have more pronounced physical UAP experiences than individuals that don't. Certainly, all kinds of people have UFO experiences, but there seems to be something about, quote, spiritual, unquote, people having more experiences. Curious what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I mean, my first thought that comes to mind is, first of all, obviously, it's a very mixed bag. I mean, you have people with these experiences who don't have a background in magic or esoterica or spirituality. So, you have a huge population of people who don't have that background. But if there is that proclivity among those of us who are part of the search, I would say that there's a flexibility and a willingness. There's no question that a not only is a willingness to believe something um, foundational to the experience, but the very willingness to believe in a way, and I'm not talking about anything psychosomatic, the very willingness to believe something may in fact increase the presence and the effect and the actuality of that something in your life. William James made the observation in the late 19th century that very belief in a creator, he saw no reason why belief in a creator would not in itself increase the effects experienced, not in some make-believe way, but in a concrete way, in the objective circumstances of outer life, would increase the effects experienced by that creator. And this has been proven true, for example, in ESP research, which I haven't even touched on tonight, an extraordinary topic in its own right, which I'll be dealing with. Well, I deal with it all the time, but I'll be dealing with it next up in this podcast we were talking about. But the fact is, J.B. Rhine, the great pioneer of academic ESP research at Duke University in the early 1930s, made the observation that a feeling of good spirits, enthusiasm, comity in the lab were the circumstances under which results spiked. And if there was boredom, depression, lack of interest, contention in the lab, results would dip. And that the individual, the test subject, might step outside, have a smoke, have a cup of coffee, whatever, engage in some small talk with the lab staff, come back in, resume testing, and the results spiked. So, and JB was so conservative about wanting to extrapolate from his results, he only mentioned this in the afterword to the British edition of his 1934 monograph, Extrasensory Perception. But he mentioned that comity within the lab, feelings of possibility, hopeful expectancy were the very thing that would determine the presence of results. It's the same thing that's been found in placebo trials, for example. What else is the placebo response but hopeful expectancy? So I believe those verities and James's observation and the questioner's observation all really speak to the same thing, which is that the conceptual flexibility, the very openness to the possibility, perhaps makes one better at measurement, to use the language of the lab.
Yeah, absolutely. And just piggybacking off of that too, it's the ability to be comfortable in the unknown, and to also, like, be someone who has experience with living in the liminal. I think that all, right, there's like been studies of people who are in places of a lot of transition, whether it's, like an airport or a home that has had many owners, or, this sense of like things passing, coming back and forth, that really opens that up too. And so, going back to the hot spots as well. And even like you're saying, Mitch, like, these moments of virality with, what becomes popular in the collective consciousness is like during these periods of great change, and what one may define as disorder and the other may define as opportunity, etc. It's like these paradoxes that coexist is also what allows a person to be open if they are willing to be. And yeah, that's, I think, what is so fascinating about all these topics. Obviously you have touched upon so much from, again, your experience in the occult and your writing upon that, and of course, this fascination, coming at it from, cinema to literature of, the others, the other world, etc. Like it all ultimately converges with this, like these periods and these people who are interested in not being any just one thing, but rather, again, like being between things. So yeah, I think that's always a really fascinating thing, and perhaps that's where the hopefulness can be in these times of, nothing's necessarily
Agreed.
set in stone as we think it is. So yeah, being
Very much.
open, yeah, very open, is important. So thank you,
Cool.
Mitch.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thanks to
And
everybody. Appreciate it.
yeah, we
Thank
look
you all.
forward to your next talk always, Mitch. PRS is always our home.
Thank you. Be back soon,
Yeah.
physically. Okay.
Yes.
Take care,
Have
y'all.
a great
Have a
evening,
great night.
everyone.
Thanks to everybody. Thanks for all your wonderful comments. They come up on the screen. I've been seeing them. So a heartfelt thank you to everybody. Thank you. See you soon. Good night.
Bye, everyone.